Hey, Riddhi is the chair, right? Can you just message me on Discord? Is it perfect if you can very quickly?
Sorry?
Can you just send me a message on Discord?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, prep time's over. Are both teams here? Is government here? Is government here? Is opposition here?
Gavesya.
Perfect. Is opposition here? Opposition?
Over here.
Perfect. I'll start with introductions. Hey everyone, I'm Riddhi. I'm chairing this round. My preferred pronouns are she and her, but I'd prefer if you refer to the panel as a whole. Can the other panelists please introduce themselves? Just a second. Akash?
Yeah, sure. I can start. Hi, everyone. My name is Akash. I have no preferred gender pronouns.
All right, great. Arohi?
Hi, Rohi. He and him is fine.
Adhipatya?
Hi, my name is Adipatya. Gender pronouns are he, they, the best.
Anushka?
Hi, I'm Anushka. I use she, her preferred pronouns. Good luck, everyone.
Great. Bia?
Hello, they are she, they. Thanks.
Hemant? Hemant? All right, we'll come back to him. Gibran?
Hi, no preferred pronouns.
Perfect. Kaushik?
Hello, no preferred pronouns. All the best, guys.
Kavita?
She and her. Thank you.
Perfect. Shantan?
Hi, he and him. Thank you. All the best.
Great. I think we're good to go. Can the speakers of government and opposition just go and introduce themselves and then we'll start. Government, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Nandini. I'll be going Prime Minister. Prefer pronouns as she, her.
Within deputy reply, they, them.
Gavwit? Gavwit, are you with us? Can someone from side government?
Check in, yeah, I'll just check in with him.
Yeah, in the meantime, Ishita will go yellow. Ishita prefers she, her pronouns. Hemant will go yellow, and Muzain will go opposition whip. We both prefer gender neutral pronouns. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you.
Just a second, I'll get back to you. I'll just call him.
Okay.
Yeah, guys, I'm so sorry. I'm here. From side government.
Perfect. All right. On that note, let's start. Is someone sharing the screen? Someone from the OC?
Hi, I think there's a panelist missing who still has to join, right?
Right. Okay. Yeah, sure.
I'd also suggest that maybe instead of the screen share, if someone from the OC can type in the timestamps on the chat, because the screen share sort of screws up the stream.
Yeah, I was just going to suggest I'll do that.
So it's going to be timestamps in the chat?
Yes.
All right. I'll keep my own timer then. Is there a way to possibly like minimize Zoom such that I can see the chat window at the same time?
You can just click on the chat icon. So then.
Never mind. Yeah, just give me 10 seconds. I'll keep my own timer also. Yeah, I'm good to start. I'm audible,
Just
right?
waiting.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
just a second.
Okay,
Is Hemant here?
Sure,
All
sure,
right. Great. PM, you can start.
All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. What does glorification look like of a leader who was popular and had political clout to such a great degree, right? Gandhi was treated as a saint and infallible at a point at which every wrong that he did was seen as legitimate, because at that point of time, Gandhi had that sort of clout that he could set like standards for the action that he did and not like determine standards by other sorts of things, right? We don't think that at a point at which you glorify somebody like this, you ever have discussions about the sorts of problematic things that they did, which I'll come to you about in a second. And we think that like the degree to which Gandhi was venerated as a whole and as a person that pushed non-violence as a legitimate the best means of protest, we think that the sort of standards that this set for protest as a whole and like its propagation within society and the sorts of impacts that it had for minorities are significantly bad, right? First argument, we think that it's extremely abhorrent to glorify an individual to this degree at a point at which you ignore the sorts of harms that have come about from that sort of veneration, right? Numerous problematic things that we think have happened, like Gandhi has done in the past, right? We think that the degree of like racism that he co-opted into and also like probably propagated within South Africa, also the fact that he did not like ever speak up against the caste system within India and continue to propagate like upper class like privileged narratives of what protest should look like. Lastly, just in terms of how sexist he was, right? He literally like used to test his chastity by asking like forcing girls into things that are like really problematic. We think that all of these sorts of things become like extremely like hard to erase at a point at which you are like erasing a minority person's pain or the persons who like essentially went through these sorts of things at his hands, right? We're not saying that Gandhi wasn't a good person or didn't make a contribution to the freedom of India, but such a person who has committed these sorts of acts shouldn't be glorified simply because of the sorts of pain that other people had to go through on these sorts of accounts, right? Secondly, why we think that the standards that Gandhi has set for protests have been bad and like hard to match, right? What this looks like essentially is that people decide what is right and wrong based on the sort of authority figures that they choose to respect and choose to follow, right? And the things that sort of happened in the past. What are the examples of this? This literally looks like communism being vilified because Stalin was, say, like a main icon who was seen as a proponent of communism. Non-violence being seen as the best form of protest because Gandhi was somebody who was seen as infallible, right? This sort of glorification leads to people's like moral values being shaped over time in a different sort of manner, and that then shapes how they think, sense and protest should work in society, right? What did these Gandhian protests essentially look like? Demanding people to turn the other cheek when they were slapped on one. We think that that's necessarily not possible for minorities, and it's extremely like abhorrent for them to be opting into this sort of a mechanism at a point at which the state and like colonial authorities and other like fellow citizens of their country have like oppressed them for so long, and they've been in these sorts of structures which have never let them like come out of them, at a point at which they want you understand how abhorrent it is to ask them to turn the other cheek, because like they've already suffered so much and their voices are not being heard at all, right? We think that like essentially the second reason to note here is that other movements that existed within the freedom struggle of India as a whole were devalued because of the overarching influence that Gandhi had in terms of the freedom movement and its face as a whole, right? He wasn't the only cause of the nation gaining freedom. We think that other protests that existed, say the efforts that like people from the Adivasi communities in Northeast India made, Dalit Bahujan activists, etc., B.R. Ambedkar, all of like these icons, their contribution is essentially devalued at a point at which Gandhian protests becomes like the face of what protest should look like at a point where he's glorified, right? He literally called out violent protests, stopped India's biggest protest because of like the small things like small beings firing him, etc., etc. But then what these standards necessarily look like come into play at a point at which people who protest violently are further ostracized within society and never given like voices to speak out and are clamped down upon, right? Why do we think like Gandhi has been single-handedly the biggest contributor of shaping these sort of unmatchable standards? The point at which he comes from like an upper caste background, fitting privileged narratives, we think that he was able to fight, say, oppressive powers like colonial like oppressors and free India from these sorts of things without necessarily breaking the sort of morals that white people thought were abhorrent, right? Which means that he still could propagate these sorts of notions like you don't necessarily have to be violent in order to gain freedom. And we think that like that has been extremely inaccessible and like it leaves other people with no sorts of other alternatives, right? The celebration of Gandhi has literally looked like textbooks after independence being written in order to like venerate him to such a great degree that he was seen as the face of Indian independence. And further leaders then also adopting this sort of a strategy because they thought that that was the best thing to follow, right? What impact does this create in terms of like standard setting? What does it do, right? The precedent for what a right protest should look like then is defined by the sorts of things that Gandhi laid out. It is used by states to move conversations from what minorities are demanding to whether it is a right form of protest which they are following to actually gain their demands, right? An example of this would look like attention being given to like BLM protests and like them gaining flag because of the violent methods that they use, rather than actually looking at the sort of things that went down because of which BLM started as a whole, right? Secondly, like we think that this also gives states the power to say that common public shouldn't be opting into these sorts of like violent mechanisms of protest, and only the police has the power to do this, which means further clamping down on minorities as a whole, right? The sort of clout and influence that Gandhi possessed over people of India means that they listened to these sorts of things and they became subservient to this form of protest, into the extent that believing that this was the only effective means of protest, and therefore like it became a social norm to follow these sorts of things, right? We think that this is incredibly harmful at a point at which this becomes your main social narrative. It denies people the right to self-defense because it delegitimizes other violent forms of protest, and at a point at which your state says that you can't do these sorts of things because we think that Gandhian principles are the best things to follow and those are the most effective things, etc., etc., right? Why do we like, lastly, why do we want violent protests, and like why we think that they are legitimate, right? Notice how like violent protests are going to exist on both sides of the house, but on like their side of the house, it's going to be labeled as something that is seen as out of the social norm and is going to be ostracized and like push these people further into oppressive structures that they like have continuously been under for all these years, right? Secondly, we think that like at a point at which you as a person thought that violent protests aren't legitimate, you would necessarily not opt into things like BLM at a point at where like your life wasn't necessarily at stake. But we think you get more buy-in at a point at which you erode the idea that this is the only legitimate form of protest, and you can have other forms of protest as well in our side of the house, right? Lastly, on why like violent protests are the only form of self-defense, we think that empathy isn't necessarily something that comes to majority communities easily, right? The only point at which they'll care about you and your demands is when their livelihoods, their households, all of these things are at stake and are threatened, right? The only way to make majorities sit up and take notice of your demands is to like speak out and like actually possess for propagate forms of protest that make people actually sit up, take notice of your demands, and then act to go ahead and follow them, right? And we're very, very proud to propose.
invite the Prime Minister for their fine speech and invite the Leader of the Opposition to start the case from side opposition. Here. Hello, whenever you're ready.
Hi, sorry, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
I couldn't hear you.
Yes, you are.
All right, just give me like 5 seconds. I'll start my speech. Is somebody displaying the timer on the screen?
Can someone from the OC please do it?
We were doing timestamps on the chat.
Yeah, I just put it in the chat. We're doing timestamps on the chat because otherwise it interrupts the stream.
All right, sure.
Yeah, because the
Then
video
just,
of the speaker
could you
won't
give
be-
me like 5 seconds to set up my own timer?
Sure.
Sure.
Yeah, all right. Just confirming, am I still audible?
Yes, you are.
Right. Sorry for that. Starting in 3, 2, 1. We think this is what glorification looks like, right? We think that when you go ahead and talk about the glorification of Gandhi in the context of South Asian independence, you mean that like you glorify the image of Gandhi as well, but like all of the ideals that he went around and preached, and like all of the ideals that he held or upheld, and all of the ideals that go around in the world under his name, right? Just his image is not glorification. All of these things that he did for South Asian independence is what you have to debate in this motion, right? Which government we think has largely not done that. They went ahead and like regretted Gandhi and like his existence in and of itself. Let's talk about like you have to tell us why you regret like the glorification of Gandhi in his like contribution to South Asian independence, right? Even then, we understand that let's be charitable and we're ready to bite the bullet that all right, in our world you'll overlook some of his holistic criticism because this motion is about contribution to contribution in freedom fight or protest, etc. Even then, I think that that's not like completely going to happen because like I think academic critique still exists. People still write papers on how bad Gandhi is, or like people still write books on how bad he was in his private life, right? And we think also that like all of us in this room as average well-read people also know that the things that he did were really wrong and he was not a perfect or like good ideal person. But like after that, this is established that we still know all of this criticism. And even after that, we're going to give you reasons why you should glorify his impact in South Asian independence, right? Before that, let's mitigate the harms that government gives you in terms of like why non-violent protests are bad. This is not true, right? First reason, because when violent protests happen, the only reason why the government has, or like the reasons why the government have incentives to trample on you when you go ahead and do non-violent protests is not because only Gandhi preached it in the world. USA also went ahead and trampled violent protests because like, not because Donald Trump read Gandhi, but because like the state has the incentive to trample you more, because now they can show the world, now they can villainize you that, oh, you're being violent. That's why Gandhi propagated the values of non-violence as well, right? Because he thought that it's accessible to people. He thought that it's hard to villainize in the eyes of government, right? That's why we think that non-violent protests or the violent protests are more susceptible to be villainized in any way. It's inexclusive because like governments do that because governments don't want to see you stand up to them, and like it becomes easier for them to trample you when you're violent, right? Secondly, we think that still non-violent protests are easier because state has now less incentive to trample you down, because state doesn't know what to do with you because you're being like really non-violent and you're protesting for your rights, right? And it's accessible to more people, and that's why we think Gandhi propagated it. Secondly, it also brings about the idea of Kisan collectivization, etc., which is really important in Indian context right now. If you like, we think that we all agree on this, and we think that glorification, this is important. We think that glorification is inevitable in all freedom struggles. We need to figure out that if you wouldn't glorify Gandhi in the freedom struggle, who would you do that? Tell us who those figures are. Tell us who those organic figures are that would have been glorified if you regret the glorification of Gandhi. They don't give you any examples, and we ask them to give that, right? Secondly, you need to like understand that in a post-conflict country or in a country that is colonialized, and you're doing a freedom struggle, all of these freedom struggles across Africa, across the whole world, do need a unifying factor, and this is what Gandhi gave you, right? For 5 reasons for that. Firstly, national unification. He went ahead and like rallied for national unification that no other leader did, and creation of a collectivized movement. Let's understand why the revolt of 1857 failed, because it was fragmented in states, and like leaders were doing it differently everywhere. The rulers were doing it differently, but like Gandhi collectivized the nation as one unified identity, and that's important. Secondly, how did he do it? He was the first person who could tap into the working class, right? And that's really important. The rural class, he tapped into the rural class. He was the first one to do that among everybody, and like because all of these people were a large group under the focus of the British government in the first place. That's why he collectivized them, and like he was the only person who was able to do that. Thirdly, the propagation of non-violence. When you fight for your own independence, you should have some principles you should point out and stand on. Like these look like non-cooperation, self-reliance, non-violence, etc. Fourthly, he was the first person to focus on economics or domestication of products, or like production of domestic products, right? Fifthly, his contribution shaped a better post-colonial nation. He allowed us to create an idea of self-determination, like Bangladesh is an example of that. His main theme to mobilize people was to reject Western civilization. He told people that it capitalizes on your own resources, it capitalizes on you, and he breaks it away from the world or like your family. This is how he decolonized people's identities from the Western rule, right? Let's understand why this is important, because in a post-conflict country or in a post-colonial nation, you need to unify people with one identity, and that's what he did. He told people to divorce themselves from Western identity by going ahead and actively villainizing Western identity, and that's why he gave people new identity of this one unique nation. It's one unified nation, right? And we think that's really important in a post-colonial nation. Sixthly, he worked towards conjoining the working class and the upper class together, right? My second speaker is going to give you more analysis on that. Moreover, we think that without glorification, we think Gandhi's contribution would have never been the focus of the movement, right? Or would have never been the focus of the South Asian independence struggle. Everything that you brought about, for example, you know that freedom is now important for you in India because people have attached this value to it, because this is in terms of what Gandhi did for the freedom, and that is the precedence that we've set for the freedom. All of these precedences and pedestalization are really important, and Gandhi did that for you, because if there was another organic figure, we think he would have taken the glorification, or like he would have taken the place of Gandhi to begin with, and like we wouldn't be doing this motion anyway. In the absence of glorification, we would have never had things like importance of protest, or like the idea of one true free India that is now being propagated in protests like CA, NRC, and protests of like farmers bill, etc. Because like these people are going ahead and protesting for this freedom, the idea of freedom that Gandhi actually gave them. And you like apart from India, the value that his name holds is important. For example, people like Nelson Mandela, leaders like Martin Luther King valued Gandhi these ideas of non-violent protests, right? Or like protests, and what he meant by liberation, like, because we think that in all movements of liberation, one true figure actually is important, because like you need one figure to idealize, you need one person to take precedence. And we think that in this is a counterfactual, right? Understand that glorification is inevitable. It would have happened anyway in liberation movements because it happens all the time. It happened with Nelson Mandela, it happened with Martin Luther King. So understand that glorification would have happened of somebody. We just don't know what that somebody looks like on Gov Paradigm, and we ask them to tell you that like what this person looks like, or who could have unified the country into one, and like who could have given a new narrative of a free India, or like who could have helped us divorce from the idea of our Western identities, and like who gave us a new identity in terms of what India looks like, in terms of what freedom looks like, in terms of what protest looks like, in terms of what it means to stand up for yourselves, right? They need to tell us who would have it been, and like if somebody that organic already existed, we think that they would have been glorified anyway. Because also note that BJP and RSS are literally trying to legitimize Godse, because like when now you don't glorify Gandhi, there is a void and somebody has to fill the void. All of these forces, all of these radical forces, or like extreme right forces like BJP and RSS could literally try to put Godse in his place, because they are trying to tell you that, oh, he was a patriot, oh, he was not that bad, he did right. That's why we need to protect like these that's why we think that like glorification would have happened anyway, and they have to tell you that what that looks like in their paradigm. With that, very, very proud to oppose.
I thank the Leader of Opposition for their fine speech and invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case inside government. Hear, hear.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. And firstly, this is the regrets motion, right? Which means we don't have to defend opposition's world of like what they think glorification should look like. We have to literally defend what glorification is in status quo. Which means at no point the side government has to defend like what 4 or 6 like well-read individuals think what glorification is or what Gandhi did. We have to literally defend like what glorification exists in here right now. We have to like fight against or like regret the fact that Indian books necessarily like prioritize like non-violence over anything. They prioritize Gandhian values of thinking and the way protest should be over anything. And that's what this debate is about. It's not about like providing counterfactuals. We don't think they have any stance there. But secondly, on the idea of like, look, Gandhi deserves it, right? And this is mostly there are 6 impacts are largely, look, Gandhi did so much, and all this was an actually good thing, and these are things that he did, right? Except note that we don't think that the metric of like regret is whether someone deserves to get this glorification. The metric of regret is what this glorification impacts people today, right? Why is this so important? We think that it's very arbitrary in terms of like how you value individuals like lived experiences, which means at the point at which Op is saying that look, the people in the past like necessarily benefited from Gandhi, and we think that no, many people were victims to him, so on and so forth. It's going to be an arbitrary weighing of like lived experiences, which is something that necessarily can't be done. What can be done is, however, we can discuss like what this glorification means in today's world, and why in a world where this glorification doesn't exist, why the world today would be better, and therefore we would regret it, right? Which means any argument to give in terms of, oh, he was very good, or oh, how much he did for India, oh, how much he did for South Africa, really doesn't matter, because that's a function of existence of Gandhi and not a function of like glorification of Gandhi. We don't think have the case there. But secondly, they say that look, oh, it's a counterfactual, so there has to be some other freedom fighter who's been glorified. Except note that one, it's largely asserted from opposition as to why this is true. We think this is absolute nonsense, right? We think often like freedom struggles in itself can be glorified, and the idea of like nationalism can come from there. We're unsure as to why their assertion means that we have to provide a counterfactual. The best example of this is Vietnam fighting Korean and American soldiers, right? There is absolutely no leader that comes to mind, but those individuals still value like their practices each other, and they have built a national identity around that, which means we regret Gandhi right now, and we probably would regret any other leader who would also be central and like glorified within this freedom struggle. We think that doesn't matter there. But lastly, the idea of like bringing people together through one identity, and that one identity being an individual in their case, right? We think the counterfactual would obviously then be like identity of nationalism and culture when you become one country, right? We think that what nationalism allows individuals to do is to look beyond like the differences in terms of like their race, in terms of like individual ideologies. It allows people who are like largely different to bind under one identity of like being an Indian, right? We think this is far better than their identity of binding under one individual for like 3 reasons. One, this is a bottom-up approach, which means the way this is going to manifest is like going to be slower and over time, which means individuals and their beliefs are going to shape in terms of how their opinions are, but largely also in terms of how much support they have for these things. So we note the comparative is like literally what Gandhi says is true, and now that is our identity, right? Which means in their world, since it's not like a very democratic formation of culture, individuals who are not like conforming to your chosen identity are likely to be like either like or like ostracized or necessarily not being seen as a part of their identity. This is far more problematic. But secondly, nationalism is even good in terms of the fact that it's something that would have existed in post freedom struggle, right? Because note, their example is literally contingent on people not knowing the value of freedom, which means their example, like their argument is contingent on people not necessarily feeling the wrath of like colonialism, right? You think every individual faced the wrath of freedom struggle, every individual was like chained by them, every individual has gone out to some extent during that time, like gone out and protested. They probably were like victims of like crimes done by the Britishers. They probably lived in poverty because of Britishers, which means this kind of nationalist identity as a point at which the freedom struggle has succeeded is likely to exist without the glorification of Gandhi, which means two benefits when we co-opt. One is the fact that nationalism is obviously going to exist, but secondly, far more importantly, the idea of like value of freedom and so on is likely to exist the same. The last like benefit they give you is that there somehow is like value of protest and so on is created like by Gandhi, right? Except note that this is categorically untrue and like factually wrong. So like weirdly, the premise falls apart, right? Because Gandhi like necessarily wasn't like the pioneer of like protesting. He was the pioneer of like non-violent protesting, and protests like existed like far before that. We don't think like we have to defend that. Before I like deal with that like rebuttals to our case and why they don't stand, I'll take your POI.
In a world where you particularly have Gandhi saying this is true, this is not true, the only reason people opted into his idea or his ideologies is because people agreed with him, they found it relatable. Why do you think it's not democratic?
Here is the issue. In a glorification debate, often you can't just go ahead and argue that since they're glorified, it's probably they were glorified because of democracy and therefore it is right, right? With two reasons why we think glorification can often be coerced. One, that at the point at which you talk to individuals who see this person as infallible, which is likely in Gandhi's case because at that point he was being very helpful and at that point he was central to the movement, means that it becomes very hard for you to criticize them because you need that individual at that particular point of time, right? You needed Gandhi, and in fact, if I was in 1947, even I would just like go along with him and not criticize him, which means it's not democratic. It's simply like a devil's choice where I choose the lesser of the two evils. But note what happens in glorification is that this coercion like has a domino effect where once you can't call out this person, the people you are talking to are also praising these individuals, which means essentially you have like gaslighted an entire like population into thinking that this person is good because one, you could never call them out before, but everyone you spoke to was necessarily good. On the idea of violent protest and why on the rebuttal to our idea of violent protest, right? And like I said, rebuttal in quotes because they say, look, like Donald Trump doesn't go ahead and like talk Gandhi principles directly. One, it's largely unengaging with the idea of like how morality across like world has been shaped because of Gandhi and the way he existed. Gandhian principles happened, right? Which means even if it's not like Gandhi in particular, his ideologies or the kind of leaders who followed in his footsteps setting those precedents is something that is still likely to be true. But secondly, even if we don't buy that claim, right? Like suppose we consider that America is not a part of this debate. Take an example of Naxalites in India, where we don't even have a conversation about whether they're asking for is fair, whether we could actually benefit from better welfare policies. Furthermore, take an example of JNU kids in India, right? At the point at which they stand for what they want, BJP is very easily able to like take the conversation away from what their demands are and whether their demands are fair to just like justifying whether their existence or the existence of that protest in the way it is existing today is fair. We think those are harms that still really exist and they have to talk about, right? But why are violent protests objectively better? First, we think that they literally ask individuals to like see to them, otherwise like there is a cost to them. That's something they haven't dealt with. But secondly, our idea of endurance and accessibility. Endurance is likely to be higher because note that violent protests give individuals like a feeling that they're actually making change because people are likely to listen faster, which means the movement is successful. The movement is likely to be more like endurable, like last longer. Lastly, on the idea of accessibility, right? We think that non-violent protests are very inaccessible, both on an emotional level, but also in terms of that they assume that you can get change non-violently. We think most people, given how they're like given like through process of gerrymandering or like general gaslighting through media, we don't think non-violent protests are effective today, which means that either you're like very privileged where like a non-violent protest work for you, or it's like as good as not doing a protest. Why is the idea of minority erasure so important in this debate? Two things. Note that at the point at which you don't recognize that other minority individuals and other individuals in general played a part in the freedom struggle, this has two impacts. First is that these individuals lose social capitals they absolutely deserved in the first place. Why is this harmful? One, it affects politics today in the fact that they can't claim and they can't necessarily benefit of the failures of the sacrifice of their ancestors, so on and so forth. It looks like the Congress party being formed in 1947 being one that is largely Brahminical and largely centered around Gandhian values, as opposed to say values of like equality, so on and so forth. But secondly, these individuals also have like no source of reparations, right? I think this is really problematic because at the point at which you don't even give them like the most basic credit for like what they have done, there's absolutely no scope for reparations or like even whether it's like monetary reparations or just like say winning votes in the future through like claiming that their ancestor worked in the past, something that goes away. But like, why do we think a simple idea and what DLO especially has to respond to is the idea that problematic practices that Gandhi did are now whitewashed, right? This is important because it sets precedent, and some people are like good enough, or if they do like good enough, necessarily we let go of things like sexual violence, or we let go of problematic things, right? We think at minimum DLO has to respond to this claim, because if they can't respond to this claim, like there is no standing in this debate. I think I'm way over time. I apologize for that. I'm really proud to propose.
I thank the DPM for that fine speech and invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue the case for side opposition. Hear, hear.
Hi, I'm here. I'll take approximately just 10 seconds after I just wrote down some stuff.
Sure, no worries.
Hi, so I'm gonna just do a mic check. Is this good?
Yes, you're audible.
All right. So my mic is not that good. So
You're not audible anymore.
am I audible now?
Yes.
All right. Yeah, so I just said that my mic is a bit bad. So if my voice gets feeble and you can't hear me for like a prolonged period of time, just let me know in the chat.
Sure.
All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Major ideas that come from opposite government bench. One, value of violent protest versus non-violent protest. Secondly, let's glorify the whole freedom struggle as opposed to glorifying people. Thirdly, what's the value of glorification? Can you critique people? And fourthly, it erases minorities. Let's start with let's glorify the freedom struggle. Right from our first speech, we told you the problem with glorifying the entirety of freedom struggle movement often is that your freedom struggle is not a monolith. It was largely factionalized, divided along multiple lines, religious lines, ideological lines, and oftentimes lines often based upon caste as well, which means you had multiple people with conflicting ideology and conflicting preferences. So it's really hard for you to glorify the entirety of freedom struggle when everyone had antithetical preferences to begin with. At that point of time, you needed something that went beyond all these things and was much more cooperative and much more collaborative with other individuals. Therefore, Gandhi's things like non-violence, things like secularism were very, very accessible and common to almost anyone, even a radical protester, even a moderate protester. That's why for you to glorify the entirety of freedom movement, is just infeasible, because how do you glorify a movement which is so factionalized, so broken down into multiple ethnicities, multiple cultures? But secondly, at some point of time, you end up into gridlock. Look at from the situation of when that struggle movement was happening. What would have happened? One of the main reasons why 1858 report failed is because just people had different preferences to begin with, and the way they manifested largely resulted into a very detrimental gridlock for you own people. Only example they gave is Vietnam. It happened, guys. In Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh was one of the most prominent figures. So you really can't use the example of Vietnam, where literally Ho Chi Minh became one of the most famous people who led the Ho Chi Minh Trail, fought against US. In that instance, I do think glorification of particular people is important. I'll give you more constructive reasons down the line. Second clash, violent versus non-violent. I just first thought that this was not a relevant to this debate, but let's engage with this. Firstly, panel, do we really think of world in which even if Gandhi's ideology stood, violent protests are seen in reference to Gandhi's ideologies? First of all, in vast majority part of the world, I don't think it's the case, because I think the reason why governments don't like these kind of protests is for one single reason, because it challenges the state's monopoly on violence. The moment you challenge a state its own monopoly, state will do everything in its capacity to trample upon you, to cramp you down, and to make sure that they hamstring your protest. So it has nothing to do with Gandhian ideology. I probably think Donald Trump never in his life read a leaf page of Gandhian ideology, but despite the fact that they always cramp upon you, is singular because it's always a challenge, a threat to the state's monopoly. But let's assume somehow it's happening because of Gandhi. Multiple reasons as to why it's much better, panel. First reason, because it's much more appealing in general. Panel, think about it. Are we all predisposed to be just people who follow laws, or are we predisposed to people who take upon arms and fight against government? People are more appealing towards the prospect because we're being biologically and socialized into a way that we're much more averse to violence than to be have affinity towards violence. But secondly, oftentimes these protests are not as appealing to the vast majority of the people. I don't take any pride in saying this, but BLM failed horribly. They couldn't get any of their proposals. They were asking for police defunding. It happened only midway, and nothing substantial came about. Lots of people came about. But the problem with violent protest is that they simply fizzle out. People don't have the capacity to keep on fighting, because violent protest also means that you get more disproportionate physical harm onto you, because authorities use the most brute force against you. At that point of time, you're literally compromising with people's physical and mental stability on that side of the house. I in general didn't believe that this was a really important argument, but we have responded to it regardless. Value of glorification, panel. We make this very clear. I don't think, yes, Gandhi is glorified. Gandhi is pedestalized so much that in India people believe in him. But is that a totalizing narrative? Because that's what Gov tries to co-opt. We do not think it's so totalizing that there is no avenue for you to look towards the other side of the aisle. What I mean by that, you can still have academic and literature critique, which means the fact that we average rational debaters, we don't have confidential documents. We know the fact that Gandhi was such an asshole is testament to the fact that perhaps we do have evidence. But I'll be willing and I'll be charitable. We bite this bullet. This guy was the most asshole person you ever saw. But why is still the value important? First of all, nation building. And the reason why on weighing this argument of nation building and spearheading one consolidated movement much more important than whole case is because this debate specifically asks you to talk about the instances of Gandhi's contribution to independence movement of South Asia. This debate doesn't ask you to psychoanalyze in the Mahatma Gandhi as a person. Three things too important. One, upon you need a social movement to have something overarching theme. How do social movements succeed, or any freedom struggle movement succeed? You attach some aspirational value to certain notions, which helps people collectivize. At that point of time, they say, "Oh, it crowds are from minority," but which minorities panel? Because Gandhi fighted against untouchability. Gandhi was the first person who was able to tap into worker and rural class through movements like Champaran, movements like Ahmadi, movements in Kheda, which means at that point of time, he was the first person who could unite and national unification happen under the garb of rural and peasantry class, which otherwise were totally ignored because rest people were even far privileged than Gandhi. Secondly, you had much more coherent and consistent principles on which you ran upon. Because if your movement or freedom struggle is different ideas you're running upon, you have no consistency on a social movement. Gandhi fought upon things like non-cooperation, secularism, and non-violence. All these things helped you create a consistent and prolonged social movement, which helped you create sufficient amount of pressure to overcome the kind of odds that you had to. Therefore, having a central theme to your movement is so important so that every person can buy into it. Therefore, Muzain's PO is important because the moment when we thought that this was a much more democratic glorification, what we meant is lots of women in Dandi March came out because Gandhi also recognized the value of women's contribution in the social movement, which means it was a movement which is largely based upon democratizing the people's participation, which would have otherwise never happened. Therefore, coherent and consistent principles were the only way that you could have maintained consistent and prolonged pressure upon your oppressors so that you can gain freedom, which means you had a much more better post-colonial society panel. Because imagine, if you once gained independence, who do you celebrate? What do you celebrate? What notions did you gain independence upon? But when India gained independence, things like coexistence. Gandhi was one person who was actively opposed to things like partition. Gandhi promoted things like secularism, promoted things like religious coexistence. At that point, in a post-colonial society, there are some values that you'll be able to uphold. You're able to uphold the value of protest. I don't think, panel, in their world, you would have even gotten the conception of protest. And the reason I make such a bold claim is because a lot of protest movements around the world, even people like MLK Jr., were influenced by Gandhi's ideology of resistance. The ideology of resistance was totally radically changed by Gandhi's perception, and nothing like this would have happened on their side of the house. Therefore, it was so important for you to have these kind of things. Counterfactual. Panel, look, just because you have to regret something doesn't take away the responsibility for you to give us some kind of conception of what would have happened in the otherwise world. Because, panel, my analysis on why having a central theme, why having something inspirational that allows people to collaborate and allows people to peacefully fight against something tells you why glorification is so inevitable. Because if there is nothing so inspiring for you to join something, you will not just care about social movement to begin with. When there is something such an overriding ideology, that's the only time when people make sacrifices and join the freedom struggle movement. Why is it so relevant to today's world, panel? In today's world, India has governments like BJP. BJP celebrates the person who killed Gandhi, who is Nathuram Godse. BJP literally venerates that person and says perhaps he did the good job. In such a world where void will not be filled by good people who make a holistic critique, it will be filled by far-right nationalist parties who are trying to delegitimize the contribution of these individuals, who are trying to promote their own polarization and factionalization, which was based and contingent upon religion, caste. Which means at that time you need Gandhi's ideology as the biggest counterbalance to again promote the notions of secularism, to again promote the notions of non-violence. At that period of time, when such far-right national governments are trying to fill that void with their own patriots like Nathuram Godse, it's even further important to have that countervailing narrative. Proud to oppose.
Thank you for your fine speech. I invite the government whip to conclude the substantive case for said government. Hear, hear.
Cool. This is a quick mic check. Just let me know whether I'm clear and audible and also visible.
Yes, perfectly audible.
Okay, perfect. Great. Just give me a second, set up my timer. Okay. Cool. Starting the speech. Okay, wait. Yeah, never mind. My chat window is also open, so be wise, please. Starting the speech, In 3, 2, 1. Concepts like freedom, concepts like fighting this big bad state that had kept you enslaved, are very dangerous to look at from a top-down approach. We've given you 2 reasons why change and social change is very, very dangerous to be seen from a top-down lens. Number one, when you look at it from a top-down lens, it is very often that one or multiple people are likely to be glorified. These people are likely to be from the same social strata. These people have the same concepts, the same core philosophies, so on and so forth. We identified 2 harms of this within side government's case. Number one, it gives the people who are glorified free rein to claim the concepts of nationalism because they can say that they have literally created the state and they have saved you from freedom. The harms of this are A, this comes at the cost of other minority stories who have probably put in equal amount of blood, sweat and tears, if not more than you have. But 2, it is less likely to prioritize them within the post-colonial structures. The second harm we have pointed out to you panel is that this sets the standard for protest, which means that the point at which you see Modi violently retaliating against violent protesters, while at the same time Trump is being demonized for violently retaliating against like BLM protesters, is because of the difference in ideology. Indians and Southeast Asians have this moral philosophy that is deeply ingrained from Gandhi. It is one that claims that all forms of violent protest are illegitimate and you should always try to turn the other cheek. You should try to show your oppressors that you are taking the moral high ground. These may be good ideas in principle, but in impacts in terms of less people being able to access these things because of the toll it takes on them. And secondly, principally, they should not be made to do this means we win this debate. What is our counterfactual? We say we want to look at the society from a bottom-up approach. And note that since this is a regrets debate, we do not have to model a counterfactual. If there's a motion said that this house regrets the partition, I cannot go back and say the partition would not happen and I can't model it. All I can do to you is to A, prove that our world has more benefits, but 2, it is slightly more likely. Why is a bottom-up approach better? It views social change through circumstantial means, right? Which means that we don't give Gandhi, we don't give Bose full credit for getting freedom. What we say is that this was circumstantial. The British left because of World War II, because they were spread too thin across different fronts, because there were various tribal and northeast guerrilla movements that had spread the British Empire thin within India. Therefore, circumstantially, they had to leave. Why is a bottom-up approach of social change better than a top-down approach? This means 1, you are less likely to idolize and glorify people, which means that their outdated moral philosophies are likely to die out, or you are more likely to simply tailor your moral philosophies depending on the circumstances. But 2, you're not locked to any singular form of protest. Gandhi's protests might have worked back in 1945 because circumstantially, World War II, various other violent protests by tribals within India spread the British Empire thin across 4 different empires and 4 different war fronts. Therefore, they had to leave. This might not be true for other people and for other circumstances. Therefore, we think that that sort of flexibility should be there. Why is like a world in looking at bottom-up approach much better, and why is it likely? Number 1, we tell you that glorification suppresses the stories and the contributions of various other people who may have put in enough and sufficient, if not more, blood and sweat than these people. This looks like tribal protests all around the Northeast, which spread the British Empire thin. Secondly, without this, sure, right? Majority of people might have still engaged in some forms of protest, but this means that there's no incentive to storm down the stories of different other people, because in a post-colonial state, you want to be the one who gains the narrative of nationalism. You want to be seen as the one who has actually gained freedom simply because of all the social capital and political capital that you get as a result of that, right? Which means that on their side, you're more likely to stamp down alternate stories and delegitimize minority contributions. We have simply identified 2 impacts of this. Number 1, minorities have no voice in a post-colonial state because they are perceived to have not contributed anything to the formation of it. But 2, even if parties include minorities within their structures, they are less likely to prioritize them. Think about the Congress post-1947. This means that the scope for social change becomes far lesser and they are villainized simply because they are perceived to have not done anything for your freedom struggle. Let me deal with like their claims, right? They say that you should glorify Gandhi because he formed collectives, because he tapped into the working class, because he spread a narrative that unification of a post-colonial state is important. I want you to ask yourself, why is this exclusive to Gandhi? Because to me, these sound like good ideas in and of itself. Any reasonable politician would want to tap into like the working class. Any reasonable politician knows that without unification of like a patchwork of states in a post-colonial state, there is going to be violent protests. Think about all the states within like sub-Saharan Africa that unified simply because it was a good idea, right? I don't think these are exclusive to Gandhi, right? Which means that the point at which we proved to you that only the moral philosophy of protest is unique to Gandhi, and not like just generalizations that you should tap into the middle class and like a unified post-colonial state is important. These are good ideas in general. It's not exclusive to Gandhi. Secondly, they say that states trample over you when you protest violently, therefore you shouldn't do this. Here's an intuition. I am being jailed by a jailer who tortures me. But one day I wake up to see him sleeping. There is a gun by his side. The gun may or may not be loaded. But because I have no other alternative, should I take that gun and shoot him, regardless of whether the gun is loaded or not? One might argue that I should because of the principle of self-defense, because things cannot get any worse. So a few responses here. Number one, the metric of legitimacy is not the probable outcomes. It is the causality of your oppression, right? What does that mean? People champion pro-life claims simply because there's this narrative that the baby that the woman might give birth to could grow up to cure cancer, so on and so forth. Those are good outcomes, but that does not mean that banning abortions is morally legitimate. Second claim, unique to South Asia, right? Trump cannot retaliate violently, but Modi can. This is because the psychology of non-violent protest has been deeply ingrained within Indians, unique to South Asia, something they had to deal with. Thirdly, I want you to know that the standard of non-violence is way much more difficult to reach on their side, right? Because of the sort of like suffering that you have to go through, right? Because of like all the pain and physical pain that you need to go through is one that most people cannot access, which means most people are likely to like not take part in these protests, but to like let's say that they do, it means that this gives the state free reign to keep doing these things. But thirdly, right, if states can trample over violent protesters, they're not only why states can't for non-violent protesters, because now the Overton window shifts, right? Which means that states determine the metric for protest, which means that they can simply shun you simply because you are protesting violently, right? This means that the scope for change is longer, which means that trampling is symmetric. Change is largely circumstantial, right? There may or may not be a World War II to push these claims to get you freedom. Therefore, your means of protest should be tied to your circumstances and should not be tied to this outdated moral philosophy. We have proven to you that protests are more likely to work simply because they are not tied to some random 1947 concept. But secondly, in terms of minorities, post-colonial state, we are very proud to stand inside government.
Thank you for your fine speech. I invite the op-whip to conclude the substantive case for side opposition. Hear him. Op-whip, whenever you're ready.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, I will not turn on my camera because there's a lot of like bad internet. I live in Kashmir, so okay, I will just give me a second to set up. I will try my best to take a POI at about 5:40ish. Forgive me if I don't. Yeah, Cool. I'll just set up my timer and I'm starting right now. All right. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. In a world where you become the centrality of a movement and people opt into you, and that is the reason you are glorified, I'm really confused as to what government's case is, who they want to glorify instead in their world. In second speech, it's the freedom struggle in its entirety. In third speech, they forget about it and they say, oh, okay, local leaders is our best case. I'm going to deal with all of this. I'm going to deal with some ideas on why this protest was still democratic and this idea was still democratic. Then I'm going to deal with the idea of like what is exclusive in this debate and what isn't. Then can you reasonably critique Gandhi with his glorification? Where is minority erasure more? And then a couple of things they haven't dealt with in terms of rejection of Western civilization and post-colonial values to begin with as well. They just said it's inexclusive. They never told you why. First, in the democratic nature, I think Gandhi became the centrality of a movement because, and people critiqued him anyway. And this happened in the context of B.R. Ambedkar critiquing him. And that critique is very popular. It's literally in your history textbook. But secondly, I think sometimes, even if you don't, in the worst case, it's not democratic, that is to say, people felt like they have to abide by it. We think these are fundamentally still important values to the functioning of a like movement, the functioning of like fundamental values such as freedom, such as self-identification, the right to self-determination that's in your context, that is in South Asian what do you call them, constitutions right now, which means sometimes people don't want to opt into fundamental values like, oh, women deserve rights or feminism. They feel like they should critique it, but some fundamental values are crucial for you to make people to opt into anyway, and we think that's a fair cause for us in this debate as a best case scenario to begin with as well. But secondly, we think it is democratic because people opted into it, and that's why he began to be glorified anyway. He didn't glorify it because God told him you are the God, like chosen one or something of that sort, right? But secondly, on like what is exclusive in like, because in GovWhip you get the idea, look, tapping into the working class and freedom are not exclusive to Gandhi. He wrote a book called Hind Swaraj on aspects that are necessary conditions that must be met for freedom. This looks like banning untouchability. This looks like the idea of Swaraj or self-determination. These are all important conditions that he argued that are important for freedom to happen, until which freedom cannot happen. That's why his entry into India and his subsequent glorification led to the ban of untouchability in India to begin with. But second, who else to glorify on Gov? At best, it's local leaders who also are going to be exclusive and not inclusive of all minorities, of all people, because they can only care about their own locality first. For example, people who are Dalit individuals or Bahujan individuals will glorify and worship Ambedkar on their side and on our side of the house because they have local proximity attached to them. Similarly, the Adivasi leader of also like Birsa, I don't remember the name right now, I'll come back to it, are also some people that are glorified in the local context because there's proximity for them within these movements. For example, local movements like Champaran movements, which is the first like movement of farmers in Bihar under Gandhi as well, which means it's all possible in our world. But the biggest problem then is if you continue to glorify them, there's no connection with them altogether. And like, for example, leaders like Birsa Munda in Jharkhand, right? Which means like if you at best, they're also going to be exclusive because they're limited to local context and not beyond that. So they're also going to be exclusive to minorities. But thirdly, Gandhi was also killed because he defended minorities. That's why Godse killed him, because he was like Hindu supremacist to begin with as well. But that's why we think in our world, you can mechanize the idea that Gandhi did fight for minorities to begin with. But second, on the idea in GovWeb, they say, oh, look, we'll just further the narrative that like, oh, British people just left. Then what do you collectivize against? How do you get the hope to collectivize against any value and of freedom of etc. when people were literally gaslighting themselves into believing they didn't need freedom under the British? They also let the religious and caste differences dictate and come in the way of the collective need for freedom, which means the society was heavily fragmented, which means that you led with the narrative that, oh, the British just left, you would have really fragmented post-colonial societies which never believed in fundamental values of freedom to begin with. But lastly, can you reasonably critique Gandhi with this glorification? Couple of reasons. We think, obviously, it's status quo right now. We think the average well-read debater knows that he did this to begin with. What are the metrics that Gov gives you? One is like untouchability. We told you how he pledged to the abolishment of untouchability. Second, we don't think he led to racism in South Africa. We think he mobilized around, like with Martin Luther King, with like leaders like Nelson Mandela to make sure that this doesn't happen. Sexism. Okay, I'm willing to bite the bullet on that. He also mobilized a large number of protests of women under the self-determination movement within through women as well. At best, we think from a lens of 2021, looking back retrospectively, we think we can glorify him and also said he did what he had to do because society was still conservative then to begin with as well. We don't think it's appropriate for you to come back in time now and to judge him from that lens. But secondly, we think multiple multiple articles, multiple like education in your history book has told you that these critiques exist. But second, both Ambedkar and Gandhi can be glorified in your world. Worst case, and we're happy to ignore them. Here's the reasons why. On minority erasure, I think they have never proven to you on Gov what the utility of these violent protests is. Second, lots of minority operate into Gandhian values. For example, Birsa Munda in Jharkhand as well. That's all his movements are conglomerated. They mobilize zamindari and lower class workers together. And like, for example, on basis of rejection of Western sentiment altogether and Western civilization altogether. Champaran Satyagraha in 1997 was an example of that. But second, we told you why non-violent protests have utility and they haven't done the same on their world, which means Modi's incentive to opt into you and like oppress you even further is because you're a threat to the state because you are violent, which means when minorities do have access to non-violent movements in our world is because one, they won't be villainized further if they opt into violence. They won't have to face even further more violent crackdown. They can opt into principles of consistency of self-determination and Swaraj. It's more palatable for people, so more people opt into them. Second, it confuses governments because they don't know what to do when you have non-violent protests. Lastly, in terms of the absence of this glorification, yeah, go for it, PY.
If your answer to all our harms is that some people are informed academics or average reasonable debaters, that is literally you going against glorification. So don't you prefer a world where no one has these misconceptions and everyone has a realistic understanding of what Gandhi did?
No, bro, because I don't think where you become irrational when you glorify individuals. They never proved to you why that's happened. We think there are reasons that led to this glorification because there are fundamental like values of freedom of self-determination that you were able to conglomerate with and collectivize against. I don't know how that unification would have ever happened on Gov because they never mechanized that to me. They have that burden and regret motion to say what in the absence of this regret, what the world would look like as well. But we think in that lens, we think the glorification of protest based on Swaraj is important because the ideals that he furthered are not exclusive to Gov, they're in our world. But even in that world, we're happy to bite the bullet and say, sure, you ignore some things, even though they're literally happening right now. Fine, we'll ignore them because we think the fundamental values of protest that you got out of it are so important. For example, Bangladesh's fight for self-determination. What are the grounds that happened on? You look at protests like CA, NRC, or Pharma protests, or Kisan Swaraj movements in India right now. They claim India as their home that people are exploiting them from, which means they claim the constitution of this India. They claim the freedom of India based in the ideas of self-determination. How do you think the right of self-determination is just such fundamental right and why controversies like Kashmir are so important in status quo right now? It's because you were able to mobilize around fundamental values that were propagated as a form of rejection of Western sentiment to begin with, rejection of Western civilization to begin with. That's never going to be acclimatized in the world where people are fragmented at best. We have local constituencies that they support and freedom circles, and at best they say, oh, the British just left. In that world, you have little hope. In that world, the ability for protest to be acclimatized into anything meaningful is very little. In that world, the governments will villainize you even more, and there's always going to be standards as to which they attach to. They'll always taunt you. At least in our world, you find protections under moral legitimacy and principle consistency that can only be mechanized in our world. We're proud to oppose.
Thank you for that fine speech. We've come to the end of all the substantive speeches for this debate. I invite the opposition reply speaker to conclude the case from side all. Hear.
Mic check. Is this a good voice?
Yes, you're audible.
All right, thank you. Starting in 3, 2, 1. 3 broad ideas, I think, from Gov side in this debate. The first broad idea is that, look, you let some people claim moral superiority and therefore it's a bad thing. Second, you set the standards of protest. And third, it crowds out other stories. So let's start with the idea of the superiority. Panel, Gov just runs way too idealistic case because we're forgetting the fact that that kind of superiority is inevitable. Did they ever contest the fact that you don't require these kind of people who are such bigger than life kind of personality? You know, people who had such great notions, such great philosophies, which were able to inspire individuals. We told you, even if it means that these people are occupying the space, it's better for you for a host of reasons because you have better national unifications. They never dealt with any of those arguments. Those are structural reasons. Things such as Gandhi telling you to focus upon domestic values that you have, tapping into rural and peasantry class, rejecting Western class, telling people to ignore your caste and religious bias and come together, unify. All of these things, panel, and Whip's response is so flippant. They said, if these are so good, anyone would have done them regardless. That's the most flippant response I've heard in my life. But if they were, why did no one else then do it, panel? If someone did it, even if it was done arbitrarily, because the debaters use this logic, because it's arbitrary, therefore it has no value. But panel, even if it happened arbitrarily, that doesn't mean what they did is devoid of any value to begin with intrinsically. Second question in this debate, can you critique them? Panel, we tell you, first we give you mitigation, because of course we tell you, in a way in this world, when you glorify them, of course we have to buy this bullet. But it's not a totalizing narrative. When you were growing up, you always read in your textbooks as a growing up kid about Pune Pact, the whole conflict between Gandhi and Ambedkar. So people still know the things that Gandhi was against and things that kind of backfire. To that extent, people know the things where Gandhi wasn't good at. But at that time, just because they had those kind of weaknesses, does it mean you totally threw away their kind of legacy? I think that's what this debate is about. They never could prove why their reasons are so substantial that you just do away with all forms of these things. Therefore, counterfactual was so important in this debate panel, because only in second speech we got an alternative that glorified the whole social movement, and in third speech, mind you, they didn't carry this argument forward. And the reason why our counterfactual is so important is because we told you, in absence of such individuals who would have unified your social movements, you would have gotten more fragmented and more factionalized society, which means much of the social movements on their side of the house were largely based upon people of ruling and elite class anyway enjoying their privilege. Gandhi was the first person who went towards ruling peasantry and women, who was able to incorporate those individuals. Have they given any mechanization of how grassroots movements would have been that at the top of the ladder somehow? Just because they said it doesn't qualify as analysis. More importantly, those fractionalized, segmented, and much more segregated societies was what world looked like. We give you structural reasons because there were different groups with different ideologies, different motivations, different preferences, which means they just couldn't have aggregated around in the same mutual way as they did when Gandhi was able to be there. That's the counterfactual they really had to defend. This will cost them this debate. Third, we told you it leads to a better post-colonial society. Because panel, will you tell your people that you just won freedom because Britishers were too weak? Or will you tell them that you won the freedom because you had the value? You fought as a resistance. You fought as a unified mass. That's what instigates and that's what inspires individuals to uphold certain values. Otherwise, panel, there was no value in what you did at that point of time. Third clash, violent protest was a non-violent protest. I think panel, they take a slim line and they say, but we just want flexibility. We don't care about whether which one is good. We want flexibility. Panel, we say you wouldn't have gotten the conception of protest if it wasn't for Gandhi. Gandhi was the first person who gave you the conception of what a consistent resistance movement looks like in the status quo. Before Gandhi, you had much more violent protests. In 1815, what did you see? People weren't non-violent. People were violent. People were killing each other. Only during Gandhi's time, you were able to overcome those barriers. You wouldn't even had the conception of those things. But let's say it happens regardless. But they could never prove to you why in Western societies people are tramping down because of Gandhi. But let's say they are doing. We give you multiple reasons despite that why non-violent protests have utility. They never prove the utility of violent protests. We told you, it makes it easier to have more allies who will be supporting you because not all people are equally have affinity to violence. Secondly, makes and shields you against the brute force because panel, it's easier to say that we will fight against you, but when they drop barrel bombs, it's a different word. Thirdly, we told you it's easier for governments to negate your demands because you're being so violent. And fourthly, because they just simply fizzle out. Even in that case, we at least give you structural reasons. They just made this argument. At that point of time, why in our world do you get a much better society? First, we told you why during those movements it was a much better society. Secondly, why even a post-colonial society it was a much better one, and why even to some extent when you crowd out stories, given that we still do, Mahatma Gandhi was still a very inclusive person. There were women, peasants, and so many other people who are part of it. Even if there was some trade-off, we think we are fine with the trade-off because the values that you got out of it were much more important to you as a nation. Proud to oppose.
I thank you for that kind speech, and I invite the government reply speaker to conclude this case from side round. Sure.
Right, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, at the core of side opposition's argumentation is that individuals post-independent needed something to celebrate, needed something to unite against, and we think that was independence. Assuming, say, the idea of one leader is still better than uniting against, say, uniting for Gandhi or like uniting under an individual, they still had to weigh that to you at OpWeb and tell you what this comparative unification looks like. Even that's that positive material. We don't think they do that, and therefore they don't have any case. I'll go over the op block, tell you why they don't have much of a case. Firstly, on the op-web side, they're like, look, democratically, they have necessarily worked, and we want people to fall into it. There is the extent to their analysis, the intuition pump that look, we want people to follow, say want people to follow the gender anti-discrimination laws and so on and so forth, even if they don't agree with it, right? Except the intuition pump works because they have taken something that is altruistic and objectively good and then said they want people to follow it. That at that point they had to show why Gandhi is that, and they didn't do that, right? Which means you have to buy Gov's care then that Gandhi was much more problematic, but often like even if he wasn't problematic, he wasn't something that's acceptable to all, and therefore you can't force people to follow him. We think that's why the argumentation at op-web falls. Secondly, at op-web they said that look, idea of protest, etc., is something he talked about. He literally wrote books, so on and so forth. Both you made a speech on like Marxism and communism. Opposition in this debate has made a speech on why they think Gandhi actually had some change. We don't think that means they're the first ones to do it, right? Op reply literally comes and says that look, protest before Gandhi never existed, as if like the French Revolution never happened and people never thought that if someone is oppressing us, we should like fight against them. This is such a bad argument to make because like it's not like there exists almost no analysis, but even if it does, it's like limited to like specific analogies. We don't think they win on that. Thirdly, in terms of what nationalism and unification looks like, and once again, OPWIP never weighed these benefits to you in terms of real benefits of protests not happening. But even then, we think we still win on this clash because of like top down versus like bottom down approach, right? We told you that even if like, and this literally comes from the fact that individuals are likely to be very different, they have not much uniting them. The fact that you force them into like one single idea of like what a nation has to be, it means you literally leave out people, right? Which means when OPWIP says that, oh, he's sexist, and I concede that, what you're conceding is not just he's sexist, you're considering forcing an entire nation into an identity where that is okay, and that's something we simply cannot stand for at Gov, right? But lastly, in terms of Gandhi's like fight for like Gandhi fought for minorities, and this is like somehow this is why we should glorify him. Except note, and far more importantly, this happens on both sides, which means Gandhi's fight for minorities, whatever happens on both sides. It's whether we should like glorify him in general, which means for that matter, we are happy to like say talk about him doing this one good thing, but saying this doesn't justify all the bad things he did, or overall he's like a net okay person because he did this amazing thing of like freeing minorities. We're unsure like why glorification is needed, right? I think this is where you realize op cases fall out, because for every response, for every harm we give you, they say, oh, people can read books, debaters already know this was in a history book, academics already know this, and call out mechanism exists. Op reply literally says that look, people can literally weigh Gandhi's bad and good. That is literally not glorification of Gandhi. That's just the existence of Gandhi and like whether people should know Gandhi existed, right? I think at the point at which op has such a weird case in terms of they saying that glorification is not like blindly believing everything and something they haven't like dealt with that came right on top of fame. We think they stand to lose the debate because all their harms are literally not what the motion asks from them to. We think we stand to win on those. But what did we told you? First is the fact that we should never glorify any individual who's necessarily problematic, and we think that this is an a priori good, like beyond any benefits or whatever this individual should get. We think no individual can like do good enough to let their oppression be okay. We don't think like you can say that oh, Hitler was okay because economically he probably helped individuals. We think that's absurd because you're literally passing value judgments on individuals' lived experiences in life. That's bad. Secondly, on our idea of minority invisibilization, the response they give you is that he fought for minorities. Except that may be true, but the glorification of Gandhi has invisibilized other minorities, and that's what you have to defend. No attempts made at that. But lastly, on the idea of violent protest, I think we win on three fronts. The only response we get on curbing violent protests from like DLO is the fact that look, violent protests will be curbed on both sides anyway because states have incentives. GovWhip literally engaged with this by telling you that sure, states have symmetric incentives, but the kind of political will and support they get to like go ahead and curb these protests is largely asymmetric on both sides. No response at op reply pretentious argument doesn't exist. But secondly, we also told you at PM that these violent protests will happen on both sides anyway, right? Which is that individuals are often angry and emotional and they will come out into violent protests anyway, which means that is not a comparative, that's not the comparative. The comparative then is when violent protests are happening, where do you support this? Which means all their examples of like, look, people have a proclivity for peace. We think people should not have a proclivity for peace, which means that's something we have on ourselves, something we like this, therefore like we directly benefit these individuals and like let them their voices be heard. We're really proud to propose.